This is our panel conversation about the Constitution, arbitration, and the worker proposal system. What I'd like is for each of our panelists to briefly say, of these three things, which is the one that most terrifies or interests you? And then I'll couch my questions to the panel accordingly after that. We'll start with Roman. So Roman, of Constitution, arbitration, and worker proposals, what's on your mind the most strongly? And tell us why, one sentence.
I've been most interested in the worker proposal system and specifically in making a competitive process for it that kind of mirrors the competitive process that block producers went through prior to the launch of the chain.
Super, thank you, Roman. And?
I think for me, arbitration I find really interesting. How are we actually going to make decisions, and how are we going to handle when things go wrong? And I'm interested to have a conversation about that. Arbitration.
Josh.
I'd say the Constitution, just because that's the core level that will dictate how arbitration and WPS and anything else that goes on chain will function. So that's the base level that needs to be really solved and figured out.
Got it. Yves.
I think that the most interesting one is the worker proposals, just because there's so much opportunity there. It's going to be such a large fund. I think that that's where we're going to see so much of the growth, the strength is going to come from the ecosystem. And the one that scares me the most is arbitration, because there's just so much potential for misunderstanding, and we're just not there yet right now, in my opinion.
Okay, Kevin.
I would say I'm most interested, I agree with Josh, most interested in the Constitution because it's the core layer that's going to, everything else is going to build off of, but I'm most terrified about the worker proposal system because that's currently a $20 million a month fund with no direction yet. So we need to work that out.
So my thesis from earlier is that we were born perhaps a few months premature because our baby doesn't have referendum or worker proposal logic built yet. We'll see what happens, and of course the Constitution's interim. So let's start off, please, with Roman and Yves. Roman, tell us, what is it about worker proposals that you would change specifically if you were in charge of worker proposals? How you say competitive, like what?
Yeah,
let us see it.
Well, there's nothing to change yet because I think you used the perfect metaphor that we're born a little bit premature and features that I think we were expecting are not built. Although that might make us all stronger because we have to go through these, these conflicts and figure it out for ourselves. That might end up being a good thing. Well, what I would do is just do exactly what you, Mr. Cox, did with EOS Go for the block producers. Put out the announcement, try to get people involved who think they can do this, and just create the platform for each of them to make the case on why they would be the best managers, why they have the best design. And then I would just sit back and make sure the media happens and let token holders vote. Yeah, it's really hard to emulate the pressure of competition manually. I think the block producers have been doing great things because they're low bureaucracy, high competition environment, and we don't want to create a low competition, high bureaucracy environment.
And certainly, I constantly wonder, what do the token holders really want, and why are they voting the way they are? I wish I understood better. Yves, what do you think?
I think what's going on right now, personally, is a lot of this, what we see in EOS, is a chain that's incredibly powerful. So even if we remove all the governance features right now, we still have something that's incredible without this. So from my point of view, I think what's important with worker proposals, with the Constitution, with arbitration, is really to tone it down, to step it back, and really take our time to do this properly. Because as Josh and Kevin said, the Constitution and these other two systems are going to be the base of what we're going to see in the future. And to get it right the first time around, we really don't have the luxury to mess this up. And so I think we really need to slow down to define and to develop a roadmap as to where we want to go with this. So for worker proposals specifically, I think we need, what is the intent of this? Where's the money going to go? How would you apply? Are there any I guess, set rules or what kind of programs or what kind of things do we want to fund with this? I think we need to take a step back and really think about that.
Like, what are the design principles
Yeah.
that we're looking for? And Josh, I know you've been very active in the worker proposal conversations. What do you think the design principles could or should or already are for worker proposals?
Yeah, I think the main thing people don't realize is there's actually been a lot of thought going into exactly what you're talking about, Yves. We spent over a month just gathering questions from the community. What do you think should go into the WPS and the architecture of it, and how it should be built to really bolster up the EOS ecosystem? And then we took those questions and we didn't just look at the way that the question was posed, but we turned the question itself around. Thomas led us through basically a building exercise to look at a question, if it's an open-ended question or a closed-ended question, and look at it from the opposite direction as well. And that basically allowed us to say, hey, maybe the thought is there, but the intent needs to be looked at in a different way. So we've been using that to help design it. And what are the first steps that we have to go through? Obviously, with EOS and with everything on EOS, there's just a bootstrapping issue. How do we start, and how do we get to the second iteration, the third iteration, and how do we do so in a way that the community can get behind? One of the main reasons is that realistically anyone could start up a WPS if they wanted to, and as long as the community gets behind that person, and this goes back to what Roman is saying, is that it's a competition. We have to make sure to build the best system. So it's not about this person or that person is in charge or running it. It's about making sure that we grab the community as a whole, because at the end of the day, the community is going to put in place whatever the community wants.
Yeah. Emily,
Yes.
you've been listening, I know. Any thoughts, anything you'd add, questions you've got about WPS before we shift over into other things?
No.
You're looking
good
so
on that.
thoughtful down there.
No, just
Thank you.
thinking
Kevin?
about-
Yeah, I think the worker proposal system it will be, I hope that we're able to look to the private sector, not just within the community, to look to for leaders in the worker proposal system, because we're essentially creating a fund that is self-sustaining, whereas a normal, let's call it, if we can call it a philanthropic organization, is going to spend 10 to 30 cents on the dollar soliciting donations.
Right.
That's no longer an issue. This is pure output. So we need to find those who are able to act as a director of such a large fund, and also staff it with the appropriate people, but then taking note of the ecosystem that we're in of decentralization. We can't have a centralized group, so how do we then take token holder opinion and apply it in a decentralized manner to this staff? I think that there's a lot we can learn from the way EOS DAC is trailblazing to say we are stewards of the block producer. We are a small few, but we can be
EOS
elected.
DAC came out like a week or a few days ago, and they had already done their own internal worker proposal system, because as a DAC, as a decentralized autonomous collective, they're running a mini version of what EOS is, decentralized entity. And they've already, I think they've leapt ahead in some ways in terms of breaking ground on that for the rest of us to learn from. I'm looking forward to hearing a lot more from them. So I imagine we'll come back to worker proposals before we're done, but I want to pivot, because as we're listening, I'm sure everyone in the audience has got their own opinions about how much money they personally deserve to get from worker proposals, and how they'd like to know how they'll be assessed and how can I put in my idea. And inevitably, somebody somewhere is going to have a dispute. This proposal was not delivered correctly, they shouldn't have been paid. Or that award shouldn't have gone to that person, you counted the votes wrong. Or who knows what. The definition of conflict is two people in the same county. Humans are very good at conflict. We're almost as good at conflict resolution. And so, Emily, you picked arbitration as the thing that was most intriguing or concerning for you. I'd like you to tell us why in some detail.
It's funny that you talk about, when you say stuff like that, I just think about how many books have been written on conflict versus conflict resolution. Like which one has more? Yeah, I think arbitration Arbitration is really interesting. I think we haven't quite figured it out yet. I think we're kind of in the same boat with a lot of these things. But I'd love to see on the arbitration side if I could like take a clock and turn back time. I would have loved to see us like kind of almost like launch a test net and then have a bunch of people try a bunch of different things and see what doesn't work, and then eventually actually slowly see what works with and without arbitration. But clearly we can't really turn back time. So I'm kind of in the same boat. I really think we need to pull back a little bit and slow down and put pieces in place that need to be put in place. We're running at 1 million miles a second. And even with ECAF coming in.
3,000 transactions a second is what I
That's
heard
right.
recently.
Is that the newest high today?
I think so.
But I think, I think we are really intelligent. We're really driven to go build a community that can actually govern itself.
Yeah.
And I think that if we're given the time and the ability to actually create a real thought process around it, we'll actually come out quite successful.
What suggestions would you have if someone wanted to set up a testnet like that? Have you thought about that at all?
What I keep thinking back to is like, we actually kind of had this conversation a little bit on the side over there, which is, I keep thinking back to, and I'll kind of talk about this, the testnet as part of it, which is, so if somebody comes in and says, and has a dispute, and then let's say that the response that they have isn't what they wanted from the arbitration committee. So then, therefore, they go back in for a second dispute to try to get the result that they're trying to get. Because we aren't developed, we haven't developed systems similar to, like, for instance, the U.S., right, where there's like a city government, a city judicial system, a federal judicial system, and then a Supreme Court. And so, like, what does our system look like for that? And then beyond that, when we kind of continue to talk a little bit more, like, right now, let's say it costs $20 to have something that you want arbitrated on. And then all of a sudden, if you don't get the response that you want, the price continues to go up. So what if you can't afford that?
Yeah.
And how are we dealing with people that can't afford that? So I think on the testnet, what I would have loved to see is what different types of disputes come up, one, and two, how do we deal with when community members, which this service is supposed to be available to all, isn't available at all because of financial reasons. So those are the two things I would have loved to see play out, but I don't actually feel like I have necessarily like a full stronghold on exactly what the right answer is.
When you pose the issue of how do we make justice or arbitration available to all, I noticed Josh reacted a little bit.
So I think one thing, the way I look at it is that arbitration is actually very well developed. It's just people on EOS don't quite understand it yet. That's the issue we're facing. It's not that arbitration itself isn't developed, it's that ECAF as a group is not developed properly, and the understanding of arbitration isn't developed.
Do you think it's not developed properly, or do you think it's in such early stages where it clearly just hasn't had the chance to grow up and be an adult and be a full organization yet?
The ECAF you're talking about?
Yes,
oh,
ECAF
for sure.
specifically.
They need to grow up, and the hard part is everyone's looking to them to have that answer right away, and it's a group of volunteers, and it's a group of people who are giving their time and aren't receiving a lot of respect back for that time, unfortunately. But that being said, a lot of people are viewing arbitration as a means to solve every single little case, and I don't think that was ever the intent of arbitration. As Ian Grigg always says, arbitration is in place to catch everything that we can't catch right away. Right. But people are looking at how can we catch everything right away, and it's not there yet. So I agree that it's kind of a black box and it's a little confusing, and I think the communication out of ECAF has been one of the biggest issues, because I think very few people would say, oh, we shouldn't fix an account that something clearly went wrong, that's provable to go wrong, that has gone wrong, sorry. But that being said, they're just not there yet, unfortunately.
Well, and isn't the statistic that, like, I think you said this in an interview recently, that over 95% of all eBay arbitration actually happens by bots? So
I'd heard that there's an organization called SageWise. They've developed smart contract arbitration contracts for Ethereum, and they're starting to do some work with EOS now. And one of their founders was on eBay and helped build the bot that would handle 95% of their on-chain, their in eBay arbitration, which makes sense because, of course, you get enough disputes about eBay transactions, they probably all have the same rough structure, and they probably tend to have the same kinds of disputes. And after a few years, it becomes pretty clear how to automate that. We haven't had a few years, folks. 35 days. So it's early. I know we're all very impatient and we think that we should throw together an entire conference in 21 days, and that's normal. And I guess for us, maybe it is. But earlier when Josh was talking, I noticed Kevin was reacting about something that Josh had said about the creation of arbitration, the maturation process.
Yeah, well, I think it has to do with ECAF, being ready or not. But it's also, when I heard that, I would agree. But it's also about the way that we've taken arbitration of how it works in the physical world and applied it in EOS. It's very important that we have a dispute resolution process, because there is no state process that can work on EOS. You cannot go to your state government and lobby for some kind of ruling and then go to the block producers, because they won't care, because they're all from very different jurisdictions.
And that's considered a strength of the design, by the way.
Right. So having something on chain is very important. If we don't have dispute resolution on chain, we don't have dispute resolution. But for arbitration, it's in the physical world is a very specific process, and it's specific in that you and I, or any number of parties to an agreement, have a very specific agreement. We have a prearranged agreement to arbitrate, and then a prearranged agreement under which rules we should arbitrate. And what we've created with the Constitution that we have now is an agreement that essentially, if you and I are both token holders, we are in agreement. That's very broad. We've created this sense of litigiousness rather than dispute resolution. You and I direct parties to an agreement, have a dispute, rather than I'm standing over here, you're over there doing something else. I notice that it's bad, or I interpret that it's bad, and therefore that's arbitrable. And that's creating a bottleneck for the cases to ECAF. And I think we need to evaluate more specifically what constitutes an agreement between two people for something to be arbitrable, rather than you and I simply being token holders. And that calls into question, where does arbitration sit? We've heard application layer, we've heard system layer. It's something that we need to work out.
And who's to say it's not multiple layers? Emily, you were reacting.
Well, I just think then it kind of comes back to the Constitution, right? Where all these things that you're talking about that actually aren't figured out in the arbitration layer actually also haven't been figured out in the Constitution layer. So once that's kind of figured out in the Constitution layer, I think then the arbitration layer will become significantly easier.
Yves?
So I echo both sentiments. I think that's the idea. So originally, Josh, you were saying, or earlier you were saying that arbitration has existed, and Thomas, you say this all the time, arbitration has existed now for such a long time. Arbitration is not the issue. So sure, some people might not understand how arbitration works, but right now I think where the bottleneck is, or where there's an issue in the community, is not how arbitration works, is where it starts on this particular chain. Where are the parameters that we're working in? And that's exactly what Kevin's saying. If we in the future get into a smart contract together, then we would appoint arbitrators. We self-appointed those arbitrators. We've entered in that in a business relationship. Whereas right now, what we're seeing on chain, we're automatically assuming that, and yeah, it is in the Constitution, so I think that's part of the issue, but we're assuming that people have entered into this contract because they're token holders, and it's accurate in the sense that it is written in the Constitution, and you've got, you signed it and everything, but it wasn't voluntary per se, and it is creating a bottleneck for ECAF, and that's what's creating the most amount of issues, I think, externally as well. So people looking from the outside looking in, the sense that we get for EOS Nation anyways, from what we're hearing from the community, people are incredibly scared about how this comes about and how this centralization of power, in a sense, is able to then make rulings, even though they might be opinions. The block producers are put in a position to either act or not act. If they don't act, then there's a perception. If they do act, there's a perception. And this right now is just, it's in its infancy stage, and that's not the arbitration itself. That's where arbitration starts on the chain and where that jurisdiction lies for current arbitration. And it goes back to the Constitution. I think that's where, like you said, we need to work on that base layer from the beginning to define that. And I think we're not ready yet right now to make those calls.
In fairness, we've had 10 years of Bitcoin, for about 4 years roughly of Ethereum, and no one's ever seen anything like this, but they have seen like rampant theft and phishing and hacking and all, and they're used to that. Oh look, $71 million stolen last month. Yeah, that's a...
Well, we're trying to apply property rights to the blockchain,
yeah,
right?
we're trying to do it, and even if it were provably better, it's still new, and new things feel weird.
Which is why we got to get it right.
Which is why we have to practice a lot and be willing to start small and do test nets and so forth. There's got to be competition, of course, for arbitration services. There's already a very hot competition for block producers. Roman, you mentioned that you're really keen on seeing competition in the worker proposals. What do you see as the similarities and differences between the way block producers are competing and the way worker proposals are going to be competing? When you think about that, you think about, okay, yeah, it's competing. The market will decide. Like we'll sprinkle magic market dust on every one of our problems, and it'll go away. But you have any thoughts yet, and maybe this is new, on the nature of that competition, similarities, differences to what we're already doing for block producers?
I think the biggest difference if we try to do a competition for the worker proposal system is that right now there is one slot for a worker proposal system. So it might be harder to get people and organizations interested in competing. For block producers, we knew that the top 50 or 60 or whatever would be making money. So it was easy to encourage all these entrepreneurs and other businesses to throw their hat in the ring and spend 3 months working full-time on trying to become a block producer. If we try to emulate that for the worker proposal system, it's harder to get that many participants because it's probably one slot that they're all competing for. Although we could talk about having side-by-side worker proposal systems. And I want to just state the counter-argument to myself, and I appreciate you letting me air my issues here. There is also a perception to get something quickly, and that perception exists too. So that's the counter-argument to me. Maybe we don't need a competition, maybe we need something fast, and then we'll improve on it later. I think that's wrong, but I wanted to give air to that counter-argument.
Josh is nodding knowingly. Josh?
Yeah, so I'll give you a quick overview of where we currently are with our understanding. If I were to paint a picture, you currently have the EOSIO.saving account that has, I think, $30 million worth of EOS sitting in it. And what we'd like to do is then create an account under that, the EOSIO.WPS, for example, that would get, let's say, 20%, the number is an arbitrary number for the moment, would get 20% of the fund above it. And then think of that as the harbor master. And then we'd basically create a ship harbor with different docks. The first one would be the emergency dock. So what needs to be done now? Security, testing, system contract upgrades that are badly needed.
Funding for ECAF.
Funding for ECAF, GitHub management repo of the repo. Things that just need to get done, that they're not nice to haves, but like things that we really need. And then from there, we can start to have competition on, the second the second dock that would be built, that call it the marketing dock, and then another dock would be built. It would be the the wallet dock or whatever it would be. You would then have all these different docks, and that's where the competition would come in. So this allows us to bootstrap the process, get going right away, and then we can build the docks as we go.
I think that's a great vision. I want to propose what might be an interesting sort of point of reference for the worker proposal system. Not yet, because they've got a ton of work to do and a very difficult job to get off the ground. But a year from now, it may be useful to have a point of reference for the worker proposals, specifically compare them to all the projects that the block producers are building. If I were to make a rough estimate, block producers spend maybe roughly half of their income on being block producers and maybe roughly half on building stuff. The worker proposal fund is 8 times larger.
4 times. Four times larger.
0.5%. I'm estimating that the block producers spend half their money producing blocks and half building infrastructure.
Gotcha.
So I'm comparing that 0.5% of total inflation used by the block producers to build stuff to what the worker proposal fund will build. So let's put that in our pockets, and after we get off the ground, let's pull out that basis for comparison. Because if it seems like block producers are doing more with 0.5% of total inflation than the worker proposal fund is doing with 4% inflation, then my fear of, high competition, low bureaucracy among the block producers versus low competition, high bureaucracy in the worker proposal fund, then that fear has probably been realized and we need to shake things up.
Well, of course. Yeah, it's okay. And of course, the block producers are spending their own money, which makes them very careful. The case might then be, let's just take part of the worker proposal fund and fund a wider swath and a longer tail of block producers and get more money into the hands of more people who have a vested interest in the success of the chain and a desire to prove themselves in the marketplace of ideas and in inventions. Maybe.
Maybe. That's a year from now. Getting this thing off the ground is not a small
So a
job.
year from now is like 6 weeks, I think, for us. Is that right?
What is it in dog years?
It's EOS years.
EOS years. Emily, you were smiling when you were listening to Roman. Was there something you wanted to inject?
No, I was just kind of thinking, everyone, most of the block producers are building projects, which I think was talked about, and so the thought of these people that are so ingrained in the actual building of this system, having more resources to go build amazing things on top of it, just kind of brought a little bit of light in there.
Right. One thing that I've noticed is that, and I want to have probably a couple of you comment. I'm going to watch your faces, and whoever gets most offended, I'll just call on you. We have a population who are incredibly fast-moving, impatient, impulsive, get stuff done. You have people who are block producers who have staked an enormous amount of risk on potentially getting in the money. They're throwing out codes and ideas and projects. And yet the craft of producing blocks is it's actually more of a utility function that requires stability and organization and DevOps. And it's like the other end of this IT spectrum. And some of you are hiring folks like that who probably hate the rest of you. And I'm wondering when we're going to see a division between like the radical creative arm of the block producer and the get blocks made arm. Maybe you're already dividing that way internally. Kevin waved his hand as I was talking. Kevin?
I was waving at Eric, who was filming. Hey. That's already the difference of, there are already different models that you see of block producers now that are saying, we're going to give away all of our profits. We're going to burn all of our profits and do nothing besides produce blocks. Or we're going to be as creative as possible. We're nonprofit, for-profit. Those are just different models. That's already happening now.
Yeah. Yves?
The comment that echoed with me is the being very impatient and being very reactionary. I think what we're seeing right now, we really need to take it to a higher level and slow I keep saying we need to slow things down because I think what we're seeing right now is everything's an emergency. Everything's the new flavor of the day, and then we react to that right away. Like we need the solution right now. I think we really need to define what our roadmap is, what is important for EOS, where we want to go, so that when there are other things that come about, we're able to stay focused and keep going in the direction that we think is really good. And I think that'll differ from block producer to block producer. But right now, because we're so new to this, and we're still in our infancy stages, like you said, 35 days. Right now, it feels like everything is reactionary and nothing is proactive. And I don't feel right now like there's one direction that people are heading. And they're starting to see some pockets of, okay, we should do this, we should do this, we should do this. I think over time we're going to see more of that.
Where do we establish that? I don't think we could do a singular roadmap anywhere. I mean, every single group in this room and on stage, we all have our own roadmaps. We all have our own priorities. I think the Worker Proposal Fund is one place that could say we're going to establish a collective group of priorities. So it would be interesting if that could be part of what they do.
Well, like first thing, I would say the referendum contract. That should be, in my opinion, right now, this is the largest priority. We don't have a referendum contract, and so I think the referendum contract is the premise to a lot of these things that we're talking about.
Yes.
So we might not have a full roadmap for EOS as a whole, but I think we're going to see pockets of different things that are going to stem or that are going to stand up and going to be important in the short term. Right now, referendum contract for me is number one.
So let's imagine we have a referendum contract. I'm going to come up the row, start with Roman and work my way up towards me. I'm going to ask you, if it were up to you to pose a question to the token holders by referendum, yes or no question, a multiple choice question, phrase it however you want to, what or choice you would push onto them, please do, choose this or fund this, what would you ask or what would you ask for if you had a spot on the ballot that you could put anything onto and you could put it in front of the token holders? What would you ask? And Roman, I want to start with you.
Well, I would assume that the first questions have to do with the constitutional debate underway, because that's the base layer for everything else.
Right. You'd go for pick your favorite of these constitutions. 1, 2, 3, 4, however many we've got by the time we're ready to vote. Okay. And let's say that's the first one, but you've also got a slot for you. Is there something you'd like to put out there? I'll come back to you while you're thinking about that. Emily.
It's funny, I was going to say something similar to him, but also potentially like a similar kind of structure for the arbitration as well. Like lay out a couple different structures and then figure out which one the community would want to vote on. But I just want to go back a little bit to that, to what he was saying earlier, which is I agree we're in an emergency state. And we're kind of operating in an emergency state, and I almost think about it like we're literally in an emergency room.
Everything's urgent.
Yeah,
and everything's brand new.
We're in an emergency room, and we're trying to put a Band-Aid on absolutely everything. And I think that'll get us only so far, because when you actually look at when amazing projects are made or feats of creativity happen, they're not when you're in emergent states. They're not when we're sitting here just out of our mind trying to fix every little thing that's going wrong. It's when you actually have the time and the energy and the space to have the vision. And so I just wanted to bring it kind of back to that, because I wanted to echo what you were saying a little bit.
So I'm hearing an agreement that we collectively, the people who are interested in EOS, need to somehow catch our breath.
And go to a forest or something like that.
Take a break.
Elections are every 2 minutes. How can we?
You have
I would
1
say
minute and 55 seconds left.
have the group that's responsible for block production handle that, and have send everybody on a retreat maybe. So Josh, what were you thinking about the referendum?
Very similar to what Roman said. I think Constitution. So I would phrase the question: do you accept the current Constitution? And then if I had to bring it back to what I think is most important then to ask it, on the flip side of that same question, is do you want a governed blockchain? So it could be that maybe 10% of us really want a governed blockchain, and maybe that should be its own blockchain. And it could be that 90% just want extremely fast speed, we want free transactions, and who are we to say, just because we're vocal and more engaged, that is what everyone wants? And we don't have that answer yet.
Interesting. Yves?
Not to sound repetitive, so I'll think of something else. The one thing that I think would be nice, and it would be nice to ask the community if they think there's value, there's so much good work going on in EOS right now, and we really don't have a body or something to be able to get out that message. Would we want that body? And if so, what would be the responsibility of that body? And what would they be doing, and in order to kind of spread out the good news of what's going on in EOS? Because the block producers right now are just in their own little holes and doing their own little things, and we're always reacting like this. I think we need somebody on the outside that can spread a message.
Somebody with a lower frequency of responsiveness, who aren't being elected every 2 minutes. And
Yeah,
stuff.
not every 2 minutes, 6 seconds, yeah.
Otherwise, the responsiveness is falling on the block producers.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's not effective long term.
Okay.
It's not, yeah.
So I think one of the first questions we need to ask are what do we want to, what should token holders be voting on, and what should block producers have discretion over? And I think we actually have an eloquent system already set up that we may not have recognized yet. We've updated the software over 10 times, and we haven't asked anybody's opinion on it. And I think that we have this dual sided, we have a two-sided coin with smart contract, Ricardian contract. Smart contract, the code of how it functions, the mechanics, this moves what, where, when, why, and then the Ricardian contract which clarifies the intent. I think that we can set up a system where if there are any updates to the code itself and updates to the way a smart contract functions, that can be up to the discretion of the block producer until it changes the intent of the code, in which case a Ricardian needs to be updated. Then I believe it's token holder referendum. There is no one more well equipped to make judgments on whether or not the code should be updated, the smart contract should be updated, than the block producer itself until we change what it's intended to be for. So I think that's an important thing that we should discuss and start to get out there and set the expectation of this is what we want token holders to actually look at and care about. That's the first thing. What people could actually vote on, obviously it's the Constitution, but I want to come up with something unique on the stage. So I think we talk a lot about free market dispute resolution, arbitration. Right now, we're only just starting to set up a system in which ECAF has the ability to identify themselves and their communications on chain. But we have no way to identify arbitrators, the actual people with the power to adjudicate. We have no way to identify them on chain. And then also how to onboard new forums themselves. With EMAC, for example, is one that's burgeoning in the Asian market, which I think
EMAC is the Mandarin-speaking group that is very supportive of arbitration. Any EMAC members in the audience, by the way? Give a little hand wave, EMAC members or EMAC supporters. Might see some of them in Shanghai when we go to Shanghai next.
But the two things to vote on, one is Reg Arbiter, which is something we proposed a number of weeks ago of same thing with Reg Producer, of this is sort of your code of ethics, and then obviously you would need to sign on with a specific forum like you would be like almost a sports team. But then Reg Forum. How do we actually onboard new forums that can be chosen and to ensure some kind of quality control on those forums? So those are the two new Ricardians that I would want to propose.
Interesting. Roman, about a minute ago you were starting to lift your mic like you had something you wanted to jump in on.
Yeah, you had asked earlier, besides the Constitution, what would you propose? I think I would propose questions regarding limiting the powers of the block producers, because there's a risk right now. We're supposed to have 3 branches of government, maybe 4 if you include the token holders, and we have one branch.
Well, the token holders are the legislature. So
okay,
that's
so 3 branches of government, but one is like a little bit overgrown and a little bit like more
muscular.
Yeah, more than the others, because it seems that Block 1 put a lot of thought into the block producers and maybe a little bit of less thought into the arbitration and into the referendum contract. So I would pose questions to the token holders, which superpowers do you want the block producers to use and under what conditions, and articulate that very quickly, because there's a risk of an abuse of power. And it goes both ways. There's a risk that we don't solve a problem when we can, and there's a risk that we'll overstep our powers and cause all the fears of centralization.
Right. Emily, you're nodding.
Well, I was just thinking, we have 10 female founders of sheOS, and when you're even just with 10 founders trying to get something done or push forward or trying to do pretty much anything, they're all completely decentralized. They live around the world in completely different time zones. And what we personally have done is we put together steering committees. So every steering committee, anyone can be in any or all of the steering committees. You can only be in the ones that you want to be in. And then those steering committees actually come up with decisions on, or not full decisions, but basically come up with presentations on different topics that we want to make decisions on. And then it's brought to a vote by all the founders. And we found that to be really useful so far. And so it just, listening to him talk, it just kind of made me think about what if we could somehow put in place something that would allow us to basically have the equivalent of steering committees.
What you've just described is essentially sociocracy or holocracy. You already knew that. And that's not an Eleanor Ostrom thing. By the way, if you're interested in learning more about holocracy and sociocracy, the book for that is Reinventing Organizations by Frederick Laloux. It's on the reading list. You all know about the mandatory reading list, right?
How many books are on the reading list?
7 currently, I think. It's an odd number, might be 9. Josh, you were looking thoughtful.
Yeah, just to echo what they were both saying, I think actually a very important question would be, does the token holder community want us as block producers to step in and work on their behalf to remove who they deem to be a bad actor BP? Right now we don't really have that authority by the token holders given to us in terms of, do they want us to even do this? Do they care enough to even do this? Because it's a very delicate thing to actually do.
Having some block producers pick other block producers to be ejected, it's like an invitation to a cabal. The risk seems really big, doesn't it?
Yeah, so we don't know yet, just based on the fact that certain block producers, other parts of the community say they should not be there, but just because they're a vocal and loud minority does not mean that that's what the whole token holder community wants. So we should be looking to get that.
Right. How do you go from a complaint to a request to a dispute to a ruling to some form of, hopefully, justice, which of course is what self-governance is. If we are going to be an effective group, we have to govern ourselves, which has been humanity's big challenge for thousands of years.
I think there is somewhat of a call in the community for block producers to self-govern, to figure out their own disputes. But the most delicate part of that, and I agree with you how delicate it is, Josh, is that you're essentially, by removing a block producer, you are invalidating the opinion, the vote of certain token holders. And
well, it depends on who the you is. If block producers as a group decide to eject one of their members for reasons, for rationales that are convincing to the block producers, you know, I'd have to ask, what is the basis in law? You know, which constitutional power are you exercising? Whereas if an arbitrator got a dispute brought to them and the arbitrator said, this person's in violation of reg producer, and as my remedy, I require them to fix the things they're doing wrong, and until they do, they can't, they're just in violation. They're not allowed to keep making blocks until they fix it. Right? That's not block producers choosing that. That's an arbitrator weighing in on the merits of the evidence, which is what arbitrators have been given the power to do that by the Constitution. It's not an overreach at all.
yeah, I would agree.
One hopes. Emily's smiling.
No, I'm just agreeing.
There's a strong human sense of fairness and justice and an anger when people seem to be getting away with rule breakage, but not every way to respond to that upset is equally valid or fair and equally serves the long-term interests of a fair and just and honest and wholesome society. And how we treat our rule breakers is really indicative of what kind of a society we're trying to create.
I think it's not only how do we treat our rule breakers, but it's how do we create a system where especially on the block producer side, there's such a level of transparency, aka such a level of communication about what's happening, that if something does go wrong, it's really easy to handle. And that's, I don't know, I find that really interesting.
Is it the transparency that makes it easy to handle, or is it something that the transparency helped create, like trust?
Trust and communication, I think, are key.
Does anybody notice the difference between how Bitcoin and Ethereum miners interact with each other and how EOS block producers interact with each other? Is it just me that notices a qualitative difference?
Sure, it's the competing to solve a block first versus competing to do the most good. And I mean, merchandising that good back to the token holder community. We're all competing to do the most good, and to do that, many times we must collaborate.
You can't hold more than one of the 21 seats, and so it doesn't do you a lot of good to do great in your seat and have the other ones all fumble the ball. Plus, if you are pointedly helping the other block producers, you look like an even better block producer as a result. Yves was smiling a moment ago.
I was smiling because I think that in theory that's the idea, right? You're supposed to have block producers that are producing the most amount of good for the community. What we were talking about 2 minutes ago was, what about the block producers that are there producing blocks but not producing good for the community?
And in some
and I
cases
think-
are collecting vote rewards
and even more so, exactly.
in violation of the letter and the spirit of reg producer and claim reward.
So I think there's also, right now we were talking, or you were talking about, what can we do on chain, or what could the block producers do effectively, either through arbitration, but then the last part would be through code to be able to remove somebody. I think what we need to look at as well is, what can we do off chain to get those people to become good actors? And I think that there's a lot of that. I mean, there is work going on in the background to be able to do that.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're all here off chains, more or less, right? We're here in the physical bodies, in a room, in Seoul, South Korea, listening to our translations and sharing a vision of what the future is that we want to create together. And that's tremendously powerful to what we do on chain tomorrow.
We have to figure out who they all are first.
Yes, that seems to be a challenge for some of them, for sure.
Some of the block producers are mysterious entities indeed.
But again, I think it comes back to, I might get hit for saying this, but just because we don't know who they are in 5 seconds after they came on doesn't mean they're bad actors. And just because we know who they are does not mean that they're good actors either.
Right.
And so venues like this, where we get to meet people, we get to talk to people, there's so much more that can be achieved in such a short period of time when people get together like this. And I think that this type of event is very powerful for that. And I think that this type of event, if it's done properly, we should be able to see tangible results afterwards in terms of more block producers doing more good, because they get a sense of what the community is looking for. I inherently believe that, just like I think is the 3 premises of EOS that Dan had put out, that most human beings, the vast majority of human beings, inherently want to do good.
And the statistics seem to be that about 0.5% of the population is psychopathic, and about 2 to 4% are sociopathic, and the rest of us are neither and would love to get along with each other. And the other ones want to hide and not be obvious that they're not doing, being good actors. So how do we proceed? Is it sufficient to assume positive intention and also to verify? What else do we need to be? What could we do better or differently at the Constitution level, in arbitration, worker proposals, or any other level? What would you suggest?
I think it'd be, in the Constitution, we try to define and delineate the powers between the different stakeholders, the token holders, the block producers, arbitration. But I don't know if we do it clearly enough. I think that just being on stage and saying, oh, well, we need to discuss what is appropriate for token holder referendum and what is appropriate to be the discretion of block producers. I don't know if that's very clear in the Constitution. That may just be my interpretation, but I think we need to more clearly define roles moving forward.
Any suggestions for how to define them, or what definition you would promote, or is that premature?
Well, starting with the first comment of intent, if intent of code changes, must be voted on by token holders. If code itself changes for whatever reason, but doesn't change the intent, then that's block producer purview. Otherwise, going back to what Roman said at the beginning, we want to create, well, at least, for whatever the high is, but low bureaucracy for as much as possible.
So we've got about 5 minutes left, and I'd like each of you, if you would please, to just wrap up with what request you would make of token holders, or a request you would make of DApp producers, or a request you would make of other block producers, or any other member of the community. What's one thing you would ask, a call to action? What would you ask of them, and why? Well, and I'll start with mine. I want the voters, the token holders, to find their voice, and either directly, or if they want to find a proxy, or they need to, maybe they don't want to make their faces and voices known directly, but they're going to have to speak up, I think, and say, what kind of chain they want and what they will and will not tolerate. Because I laid out earlier Ostrom's 8 principles for effective self-governance, and we're lacking on a couple, and it's a concern. I don't know that we've got an infinite amount of runway ahead of us to repair that. So that's my request is to the token holders. But Roman, do you want to take a stab at that?
I'm not going to have a request of token holders because I feel like everything's coming. Not as quickly as many of us want, but I feel like it's all coming. Like already media is getting better, token holders are getting smarter, and I think once we give the community the tools, like the referendum contract, I think we'll discover that voice is there. Maybe once I hear the voice, I'll have more to say. But for now, I feel like it's all coming.
No other requests of any like block producers or dApp developers? That's fine. So Kevin.
Maybe boring, but vote. And by voting may spark the curiosity to explore. And then also it's one of the things that Yves said was let's also remember, I know this is the governance talk, but the technology is fantastic. There are issues that we're going to work through, but that's first and foremost. So my request would be play with the technology and vote, and by both ways you're the best involved token holder you can be.
Thank you. Josh.
I think educating yourself. There's a lot of great content being put out by block producers, and if you're going to ask a question and want to change something, first see what it is that you're trying to change. Is it already in the code or not? Where do you find it in the code? It's a matter of don't just be a voice, but be an informed voice. And that's something, it's hard for us to constantly educate each individual person rather than put something out and hope that they'll all go to that same place.
And a parallel request might be for folks to create those educational tools and portals and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Super. Yves.
I echo that as well. I mean, education is really, really important. And I think what's important as well that we kind of briefly touched upon, I think we need to define or at least figure out what is Block One's role in all of this. I still think we're not too sure what Block One's role is. I'm not even sure Block One knows what Block One's role is in all this. I think the intent originally was, here's software, community, do. And we've seen Block One come back and say, well, actually, community do, but only in this matter. Or community actually not too cool with what you're doing. So that, I think, it should be a focus for sure. Figure out what we want Block One's role to be.
And ask them to do it, yeah.
And ask them, yeah, because we're the community. So, I mean, Block One, if really the intent was they're creating software and they're handing it over, really hand it over.
Gotcha. And final word, Emily Bush, sheOS.
So I'm gonna echo Kevin, but I'm gonna kind of do it through a story. So one of our steering committees at sheOS is the foundation. So one of our pledges is to bring scholarships to women to actually learn how to code. And recently we were running around and we were kind of looking at a handful of different schools that we could fund. We were looking at a handful of different ways that we could kind of form the project and start actually having scholarships, funding women with scholarships. And what we realized is that it shouldn't only be our decision, and that it should be actually a community decision, and a percentage of all of our rewards are going towards this. So what we've been kind of like planning on doing is, and we also think that this will benefit the EOS community further, is doing a sheOS token, and airdropping the sheOS token so that all the EOS holders actually get an opinion on where our rewards are going towards and what scholarships are being given to different women and what schools the scholarships are going to. And one reason that I bring this up is because I think that voting is so important. I think it's important internally, and I think it's important externally. And I think that we have an opportunity right now to shape a completely new, for lack of a better word, like governmental system within this space right now. And for everybody that's holding one of these tokens and that isn't actually making a cognitive decision about what they believe in and what they don't believe in, They're just kind of sitting on the sidelines. And so I'd love to see more activity, and I'd love to see more activity, especially on the voting.
Thank you so much, Emily. Thank you all, Josh, Yves, Kevin, Roman, Emily, for being up here with me. I'm Thomas Cox, and that is the end of our panel. Thank you all. Take a 10-minute break, please. 10 minutes. Big hand for these folks.